So, the Spear Danes in days gone by and the Beowulf. This is a long one. Ah, there you are, Steve. How you doing, sir?
I'm good, mate. I'm not too bad. Sounded like you had your head in some old sort of Anglo Saxon linguistics or something similar.
Beowulf, or Beowulf, or however you want to pronounce it, which I believe you've got the book too as well.
I do indeed.
Have you read it?
I have indeed. I read it this year.
Right. What, it took you all year, or...
I read it very quickly, actually, Mark. I'll have you know.
English version or the original?
Well, I'd love to say it was the original, but that would be a complete and absolute fib.
Right.
It was the English version.
Yes, and even that's
I can remember actually doing it in English literature at school, and I thought to myself when I saw it when I was browsing a bookshop, which is just a lethal thing to do because I come out with too many books, and I saw Beowulf and I thought, oh gosh, I've not read that since I was about 13. I need to buy a copy and read it, which I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I'm sure you did, because you do like old books and stuff like that, don't you? The esoteric.
Yeah, all of that.
Well, the thing about Beowulf, it's roughly the Saxon era.
Yes.
You set a challenge, and I say you, that since we're ex-Navy, why don't we do a history of the Navy? As if we could do a history of the Navy, starting off with the Saxons, and therefore Beowulf, although that's got nothing to do with the Navy. So I'm going to just throw out there to begin with, when do you think that the so-called round wall of, well then England or Britain, actually became the Royal Navy?
When do I think it became the Royal Navy?
Well, this is it, because it's open to debate.
There's a lot of debate around it. I mean, what are we looking at? The history of the Royal Navy would have probably started in 1546 with King Henry VIII establishing the Navy Royale, or Royal,
Yes.
the Navy Royal. So that's probably when the Royal Navy came in. But we all both know, don't we, that there was stuff going on those not Emerald Isles, those British Isles.
I thought you could say Emerald
as well. On those British Isles, we know that there's some other stuff going on, don't we?
Yeah.
So, what are you going to tell me about?
I've got a book here by Arthur Bryant, and it's about Samuel Pepys, or Pepys, because we don't even know how that was pronounced. And it says here, till a revolution in national finance and opinion should make it possible, permanent naval supremacy there could be none. And this is in the 1680s. Yet all else that was requisite for the supremacy was by then already achieved, he says. So the Navy, as we know it, really didn't kick off until after Pepys, 1680s into the 18th century. And it's not just putting ships to sea, it's all the other stuff that is required with it. So yeah, we can go back to Saxon times, we can go back to Tudor times, and we say the Royal Navy, but Saxon times, it wasn't the Navy Royal, and certainly it wasn't the Royal Navy of the Kingdom or the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom did not come into being until 1801, and the Kingdom of Great Britain not until 1707. Before then, it was England. It was the English Navy. So we could go back and look at the Proto-Scottish Navy, because they had one. But let's start with the Saxons.
You talked about the time of, let's call him Samuel Pepys, because it's just the easiest way to refer to him. So Samuel Pepys, you talked about him and the establishment of, what would be the progenitor, I suppose, of the Royal Navy. But it's right, if my understanding is correct, and please correct me on this, that the sort of Royal Navy was only really established, obviously, 1546, Henry VIII, and then it was only after the restoration of King Charles II in 1660 that the Royal Navy actually came sort of, if you like, was badged. Would that be about right?
Yeah, a lot of historians will go back to Charles because he brought in the fighting instructions. Pepys was the Admiral Secretary twice. It was really his second time that he came back and made more permanent effect on what would then become the Navy. If it wasn't for him, it's doubtful whether we would have had Nelson 100 odd years later and so on, because he brought in a professionalism and an authority, because the biggest thing that he struggled with coming back into the Admiralty was that captains would go off and half the time just make money transporting bullion, and he had to curb that kind of, what was almost like semi-piracy in some instances. So yeah, it was relatively later than most people think.
Okay. So if we were to dial the wheels of time even further back into the dim and distant past, then the sort of established belief has been for many, many, many years that it was Alfred the Great who was king of the Anglo Saxons from 886 to 899 AD.
Father of the English Navy.
Yeah, that's right. So that's as you've read. But is that right?
No, because there was a battle in 851. It was the first ever naval battle. Athelstan, he helped fight off what we would call the Vikings, or the Vikinger. And they were starting to predate the shores of the east and the south. We say naval battle, it was more like a skirmish. And the navy itself wasn't a standing force. And even with Alfred, it had to be at the king's expense. This is the beginnings of where the king, or the keeper or the provider of the bread, which we can talk about in a moment, he had to make sure that he was protecting the coastline because that was expected of him. That was part of being allowed to be king. But yeah, Alfred is often, especially in Victorian literature, he's seen as the start because he's a figure in which the Victorians liked to talk about, just like they like to talk about Runnymede and Magna Carta, and it became almost like a fabled person, a fabled event.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely spot on. So that's basically sort of where I've come back to. It's right back to Athelstan, right back to that battle with the Vikings, somewhere off Sandwich that way. And that's probably the first recorded incident that we've got, as I understand it, of any sort of naval engagement of any description. Not necessarily with an established naval footprint, but with a cluster of vessels that were under the command of Athelstan and one of the ealdormans as well, I believe. What was his name? Ealdorman Elkir and King Athelstan. And so Athelstan was around 839.
Yeah.
Count, for those who are interested, is actually in the Anglo Saxon Chronicles.
It is.
That's where it's found.
It is.
Which I have a copy of in here somewhere.
Of course you would, Steve. I did not expect you to not have it.
I do. I think it's up here. Let me see. Let me see if it is. No, that's Leechcraft.
It's looking at it now. He's got this huge wall of books. Actually, give due to you, Steve. They are very good and often classic books.
They are very good books, Mark. They are very good. Yeah, they are very good. But I'm pretty confident that I've got a copy of the Anglo Saxon Chronicles. It's just tucked away. Yes, tucked away somewhere in amongst all these other things. But
well, while you're looking, Steve, I will throw the oar in here.
I'm back.
You could go even further back to the Classis Britannica, which is one of the many, well, certainly by the 3rd and 4th centuries, that the Roman Empire had begun to place permanently at various places around the empire. So there were forces on the Rhine, the Danube, around the Mediterranean, and one off the southern coast of Britain. And in fact, they were based at a place called Rutupii, which is Richborough. That's in Kent, isn't it? And the other one was, well, they had the gall to put it over in Gaul at Gesoriacum, which is modern-day Boulogne. So there were two fleets or sets of ships in those two places, because we've got to remember that we see Britain now as its own independent nation away from Europe. The Romans didn't see it that way. The Channel was just almost like a waterway as between Italy and Sicily. They didn't see any difference, and so they were prepared to put their fleets on both sides of that.
Are you trying to tell me here, Mark, that the lineage of our Royal Navy and those sleek grey warriors of death is actually Italian?
Well, again, why not? Because the Saxons aren't British. Because you've got to have William the Bastard, and he was a bastard. He was also a conqueror. He comes along and he brings over the Norman heritage. So what we see as the Royal Navy to do with Britain, well, it doesn't have its forebears that neat.
Are you telling me that the country of the British Isles is a patchwork made up of a duplicity or more of other nations, all interwoven to build this incredible fabric of society? Is this what you're telling me, Mark?
Yes, because when you say Saxon, do you mean England or do you mean Wessex? Do you mean Kentish coast? Was that a joke? What did the Celts say to the Anglo Saxon when a king fell on top of him? He said, "Get off of me."
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah.
I like it very much. But you need to know about King Offa for that one, though, don't you?
Yeah, he was a dyke, I suppose. No, well, he had one.
Yes, indeed, indeed, indeed. So that's where we're at then, mate. That's where we're at with this. It goes all the way back to the Romans, you reckon?
You could argue that. I wouldn't say so. Not for the Royal Navy, but there was a naval force. I just like the fact that there would have been a time that there would have been 2 drunken Roman sailors, and they would have gone into the nearest taverna, and they would have walked in, and one would have put up 2 fingers and said, 5 drinks, please.
One indeed would have done that, I'm sure.
There would have been Marcus, and there would have been Stephanius.
Yeah, something like that. Yes, those 2 old Matlows have travelled around to a few tavernas over the years, I can tell you.
All jokes aside, when the Romans left, when they earthed off, it created a vacuum, and as we know, history doesn't like a vacuum. So what was brought in were the Saxons from the part of northwest Europe that we now consider to be the pre-runners of the British. You only have to look at their language and know that that was not the case. Read Beowulf, and you'll see that the Saxons were not as we would like to think. And they had to create a defensive element, but it was mainly the army, the feared, as they called it, FYRD. And therefore, any ships that were attached to that in the Saxon times was really part of the feared. It was just mainly to get them over to the continent. It was not a standing navy. They had to recruit quickly to get people onto the ships. They would have been beached or whatever, rotting somewhere in a river, and then hopefully, if anything came into sight and they had enough time to get them to sea, they would have done so. But it was haphazard.
Yeah, well, it's like everything that sort of has been generated out of Britain. It's always generated best from a haphazard platform, and then we seem to sort of chuck it all together and make it work, which is fantastic.
That's what Churchill said, isn't it? He said, "We're terrible in peace, but fantastic in war."
Yeah, we've done a great job in many of those areas, I feel. No, it's quite fascinating. Obviously, with the Royal Navy, in terms of where we can really flick it back to, as I say, I'd go back as far as 1546 with the establishment of the Navy Royal, and obviously then sort of badged, if you like, a little bit later in 1616 with the restoration of King Charles II. That's probably where we would sort of anchor, to use a nautical term, anchor ourselves in. But I do think it's really interesting that we've got that naval battle that went on, and that Alfred the Great was the one that was originally, and until only quite recently, actually, he's sort of been knocked off by about 20 years with that from the Anglo Saxon Chronicles. So it's only in recent years that. Searched by Matt Frith, I think.
Yeah.
I think his name was Matt
Well, that's
Frith.
the thing about history. We talked about that, didn't we? You know, history changes because someone will always come along and re-evaluate it. The interesting thing about the Saxon period, do you know it's the oldest recorded joke in the British Isles? It's from the 10th century. And it's more a riddle. See if you can get what it is. What hangs at a man's thigh and wants to poke the hole that it's often poked before?
Well, look, that to me sounds like something quite sexual.
What's your mind? No. The answer is a key.
Of course. My mind was going straight there, Mark. I don't know where your mind had gone.
Yes, exactly. I'm just saying that was the oldest recorded joke, and it was in the Saxon era, the 10th
still
century.
wonder they didn't last.
And they were actually quite a funny set of people.
They must have been.
Chaucer inherited and took a lot of that, didn't he, with the Miller's Tale, when that guy puts his arse out the window and stuff.
They must have been an interesting bunch of dudes. I mean, they hung in there from, well, the Anglo-Saxons did what, from 410 to 1066 or something like that, didn't they? That was about right, wasn't it? The Romans pulled out of Britain in around about 400 AD, around about there, wasn't it?
Yeah, it certainly started to collapse by the end of the 380s into the early 400s, but by certainly 450s, it was pretty much over. And then, as I say, the people came over, mass migrations often. In fact, there's a great board game called Britannia you ought to get, and it's all about that. It's
really?
Fantastic game. Just a few more things about the Saxon Navy. What we have to understand, if the fact we can call it a navy, is Britain is an island nation, and it's girt, that's a great word, girt by water. There are 4 ships mentioned in that Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that you talked about. Ship, which was probably a half-decked affair. Longship, which is probably undecked. Hulk and boat. That's pretty much it. And, of course, that's using modern language. But what's noticeable, certainly for the age of sail ships, they had the use of a steer board because there was no rudder. And it was often off the right-hand side. It was a board that was used for steering. Starboard comes from that. And the opposite side, before it was known as port, was larboard.
Larboard, yeah.
Yeah, starboard and larboard. Despite the fact being an island nation, in that time wasn't really needed. There was no need for a navy. Not then. It would become so much later. Mainly with William the Conqueror.
You learn something new every day, Mark, on this channel. It's the beauty of it.
What I will also say is for anyone listening, and we can never judge whether it's anyone's listening or even interested, comment if you know anything about the Anglo Saxon Navy, because someone will know more than we do.
Oh gosh, there's bound to be. I mean, there's lots of people out there that know more than we do, apparently.
I think that's obviously to most people listening to this now.
because some of them even tell us that they know more than we do in their comments.
And then proceed not to say anything.
Yeah, that's right. But there we go. No, it's excellent. Very good. Well, I'm very pleased to hear that we've solved that riddle now. Not only solved the riddle that the earliest riddle from the Saxons, but that we've also discovered and tied down the Royal Navy all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles in around about 850 odd AD.
So do I take it then, if we do a follow-up episode, it will be Norman times up until, say, the Tudor period or beyond?
Well, we could look at that, couldn't we? What happened then? What happened with the Royal Navy? Or the fledgling Royal Navy, the fledgling Navy as it was morphing into this incredible blooming of maritime might and power.
Yes. Oh, well, that's another thing, of course, and it would link in with the episode Jack Speak, that we should never underestimate how important the Royal Navy was historically for Britain. And it even completely altered the language. A lot of sayings are no longer used, but, up until our time as children, they were very common, like 3 sheets to the wind and whatever.
One of the things that fascinates me about the Royal Naval language is that I still use it. I use it all the time.
Yes, I remember being on the Charybdis, and you loved to come out with all the salty aphorisms.
And I think the reason why I still use it so much is because I've been surrounded ever since leaving the Royal Navy with ex-forces guys who are either Marines or whatever. And so we all speak the same language. And it's just part of my everyday vernacular.
So you're still fluent in it?
I'm still relatively fluent. I mean, I was even talking to you a little while ago, wasn't I, about taking a bimble. And you're like, bimble? What's a bimble? No, it's like just walking slowly along. It's a Jack word. And you're like, what?
Yeah.
So no, I do it all the time.
So Saxon Navy, give us a few comments if you know anything that we have missed, and believe me, we've probably missed quite a lot.
We've probably missed about as much as there is ocean covering the planet. But anyway.
All right, mate.
Take care, fella.
Next time, then.
Yeah, bye.
Take care.